Good to go? All right. Yes. We'll start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people as the traditional owners of the greater Walyalup Fremantle area and recognising that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still important today. We note that the meeting is being recorded and streamed live online while all care is taken to maintain privacy. While there are no visitors in the public gallery or members of the public submitting a question, we will all be captured in the recording. There are no members with an apology, although I know Councillor Van Dawson is online and Councillor Slaughter is observing online as well. And there are currently no requests for a leave of absence unless there are any from members of the committee. All right. Are there any disclosures of interest by members for the agenda this evening? Fantastic. This is our first meeting, so there were no questions taken on notice at previous meeting, and there are no the members of the public to speak tonight. So maybe they didn't know that planning committee was happening. There are no deputations or presentations and no previous committee meeting minutes to accept. Do any committee members have communication to share? No. Well, before we get into debate, I thought I would also remind other committee members, like I was reminded this evening, that the standing orders are slightly different. There's no restrictions on speaking once and then asking questions. It is a little bit more flexible and open in a committee. And I will move to the first item, which is Local Planning Scheme number 5, Project Overview, if there is a mover. Thanks, by Mayor Lawver, seconded by Councillor Sullivan. Over to you, Mayor.
Yeah, that's thank you so much for that. I just actually had a couple questions on the timeline. That's what the project overview. In that, we've got something that says we're going to have some things prepared by the end of this month. Let me just pull up. Sorry, I'm going to scroll down here. In the end of April, and just was wondering if the timeline that's in here, if that may need to be pushed back a little bit, or if we still consider that to be something that we can achieve. I'll find the exact thing in a moment.
Through the chair, we made that initial workshop listed there, we may push back so that it's after the first council meeting when the committee's recommendations will go to council. So we're definitely on track to have things prepared and ready to go. So we'll try and host that first workshop straight after that first council meeting in May.
Okay, here, yeah, the question that I had though was about, it says we'll have a draft a new scheme in January to March and have stakeholder workshops and engagement between January and March 2026. We're in April, so just was wondering if we've done those things already.
Through the chair, the drafting of the scheme is effectively going to be ongoing throughout the whole year. The final version of the draft will go to council, we're hoping, by October towards the end of this year. But officers are already working through looking at the existing scheme, looking at the state government's planning framework and starting to have those conversations. Stakeholder workshops have been ongoing, and we're looking to get some public consultation out very soon. There are really strict processes around how a scheme can be advertised though, so it is going to be more about touching base on some of the outcomes of the planning strategy and strategic community plan engagement that we've done. Almost a pulse check to kind of make sure that those thoughts and sentiments are still out there in the community. So we're working through that, and that while the timeline is a bit of a snapshot in the report, it's not necessarily fixed. So this period for this year is really just up to council we have through this forum and elsewhere, and what officers can achieve across the year. So it just gives a snapshot about how the process might look, but it's not fixed.
I might ask a quick follow-up question. With the stakeholder engagement that's gone on so far, will we expect to see a report come through this planning committee perhaps at the next meeting on what's already gone on? Or when would we expect to see the report on that?
Through the chair, we can definitely bring some information through the committee just to let you know what the sentiment is from those stakeholder workshops. Again, they're going to be ongoing, so we're sort of starting to check in with them. A lot of it is about looking at how they're feeling about development generally, how they're finding and how they've found the process in getting development applications approved across the time, and what's positive about our planning framework, what potentially holds them up. So we can definitely start bringing that information through as we gather it.
Thanks. A bit of a brain dump, so if that's all right. I guess a couple of things that sort of jump to mind. You've already sort of holding stakeholder workshops and have been for a while, as I understand, but without any sort of elected member involvement. In the past, a lot of these approaches have been sort of more collaborative, more fulsome, in the sense that elected members would be either at least invited to be the fly on the wall, or actually be involved. So I'm just sort of wondering whether all of the stakeholder kind of involvement is going to be run that way. I kind of have a bit of a bee in my bonnet a little bit that the city goes out and assumes that it's the 100% communicator with the community, and yet I feel that's my job too. And so if the community are communicating back to the city, and they're only communicating to the city and not to elected body, then I'm 100% reliant on the report that people provide me. And if someone in the community said, that's not what I said, then I have no idea, what to take stock of. So I just sort of raised that as a general comment. I would kind of like hope that, things like the big scheme amendments, like Amendment 49, were done with everybody in the room all at the same time, and there wasn't any real problem with elected members being overly dominant. I think most elected members know to hold back in situations where the community are being invited to have their say, but are there to sort of, maybe pitch in a little bit with sort of background where it's needed, or thoughts where perhaps they're needed, to steer a conversation that, or to expand a conversation, probably is the best way of defining it. So if that could sort of, if the city would like to take that into consideration, that would be good. Other thoughts that I had in terms of, I guess, the timeline, and looking at the workshops and the list of subject matters, there are a bunch of things that I sort of like wrote down and suddenly went, well, when would we be talking about these? So some of those include, in no particular order, the McCabe Street precinct, to me, is a really important item going forward and has been difficult up till now. The Port Beach environment, obviously, is work in progress. Unfortunately, the work seems to be done at the state and developer level a little bit. The South Fremantle, I guess it's still classified as neighbourhood centre, but the shops down in South Fremantle, the Woolies and the like, but also the combination of that shopping centre and the mixed-use zones next to it, and whether, going forward, that's the right solution for that area, or whether in fact it should be a district centre or some other form of thing, and how also, given in that precinct, literally on both sides of Hampton Road, so whether you're looking at the mixed-use zones which cover both sides of Hampton Road, or you're just looking at the neighbourhood centre or district centre, whatever we're going to kind of classify it as. We have, I guess, problematic ownership structures, and in some ways problematic attitudes towards redevelopment by some of those owners. And so whatever our scheme does is probably going to need to be done very much hand in glove with them, but also it may well need to be one that incentivizes a different attitude from those landowners, whether it be to get them to the development table or to get them to sell to someone who will come to the development table. So that's a really important one for me, and it should include areas like the Portuguese Club site and the like. The other ones I sort of wrote down were sea lanes. What do we, how do we just re-amalgamate that back into the general stock or the like? Questioning whether when we're going to have a conversation about Knutsford Street, are we meaning Knutsford and Swanbourne areas or just Knutsford? I guess the other one is O'Connor. So when we do look at the industrial area, the need for that really strong consideration of what the different opportunities and options might be along South Street, along Carrington Street, and the like. So that's some of them. Then there were also matters which are sort of smaller issues, but they're things that really have irked me over the years. So, for example, if I look at the Leighton Beach redevelopment and the fact that we were duped out of having commercial development at the ground floor of that major open space. So the whole investment from the community, investment from the city, investment from the elected body to come up with a really clear strategy and try and put it into a scheme, still didn't manage to deliver that outcome. To a lesser degree, the North Bank development's the same. So, when we looked at, reviewing that and we go, oh, well, there's, a couple of office developments. Well, those office developments were supposed to be cafes and restaurants and fish and chip shops and those sort of things, and that's never eventuated. So what do we need to learn from those experiences in terms of a town planning scheme? Because they very much let community down. They're probably more issues that are just in that pot of issues. What have we learned from the last 20 years? So I'm happy for some of those not to be subject matters, but actually just going into that pot. And I'm hopefully someone's keeping a sort of a list of them as we go through. The other major one that really speaks to time frame and process is are we going to need to get, I guess, a draft of the important policies at a time that sort of coincides with the draft of the scheme? And I know that's not what's sort of currently, it's actually currently proposed to be, we get the draft scheme and then we start working on the policies while the Planning Commission is spending a year and a half having our scheme on a desk somewhere. What I worry about in advance is, are there going to be some controversial issues that come up as part of the scheme, particularly where we might be taking out protections that are currently in the scheme and having to put those into policy, but those policies aren't drafted. And are we going to, take the West End? Are we going to end up with, I guess, criticism or fear in the community that because they're not in the scheme, where are they? You're dumbing this down. We are not protecting this or that because they can't see the policies. So are there some policies or some areas where perhaps we actually need to be giving the community some level of confidence, even if it's a skeleton policy or what will be included in those? I think that's something that we're probably going to need to think about in tailoring the process. We want to bring the community along with this sort of process, so we need to understand what their fears might be along in the process. The last one for me, there was, when we talk about the city centre, we seem to have multiple definitions of city centre in different documents, and in fact multiple definitions even within the same document. If I look at the city plan talks about the city centre, and then it talks about the other city centre, the smaller city centre. I think the use of terminology is really important. The use of a term like city centre can mean so many different things to so many different people that maybe we need to look at our language so that we're not being confused about it. And if you think about in the past where different people had different versions of what the West End is, and how controversial that has been for the city over the years of saying, you're not protecting the West End. Well, we are, yeah, but you're not using my definition of the West End. My definition is bigger than your definition, so it becomes problematic. So it's one that sort of jumped out at me as I was trying to refer to city centre, and there was some terminology in the report that talked about the city centre ending at Queen Street and Beach Street, which is kind of like, I didn't understand that at all, because that's not in any definition of the city centre, so that I could see. Sorry for the brain dump, but that...
No. Thank you. Yeah, kind of to that point, Councillor Sullivan, some of our policies as well that we've been updating because there's been definition changes at the state government level. Neighborhood center, local center comes to mind right away, but I'm sure that there's been more. So, before we get to the first draft of the scheme, potentially towards the end of May or thereabouts, I was wondering if we could maybe send the model text out to elected members, so that way we all kind of know where we're starting from. And to Councillor Sullivan's point, we might then know what things we want to have in a policy or things that we may want to be putting in the scheme. But I think starting from that point will help with our terminology and what we're calling things and the language that we're all going to be using here, and as well as giving us that base kind of starting point. And I guess I also had a similar question about, because in theory it sounds great. You have a scheme where we protect the things we care about most, and then we have policies that protect the things that we care about almost as much. But what is the timing of that? Because if we have a scheme sitting there waiting, do we have our policies then waiting to be adopted, or could we adopt policies for a scheme that hasn't been implemented yet? So I guess understanding that juxtaposition and timing would be very helpful for me.
Thank you, Mayor Lawver and Councillor Sullivan. I agree. We'll get a clarification, from the manager. Thank you.
Through the chair, I'll start with that final question, and if you'd like me to respond to some of the other questions that were in there, I absolutely can do that as well. In terms of the policy discussion, there's two ways you can do it. You can try and draft all your policies and your scheme in one hit, which obviously extends the time frame significantly, particularly when we're now in this position where the model scheme text requires a very slimmed down version of the scheme. The aim with the scheme is that those important things, the protections, the key measures are in there, and the policies then expand on those things, and they vary elements of the R codes and get down to that granular level. So obviously, that's quite a change from the scheme we've got now. Our current scheme is very detailed. The feedback we're getting is it is frustrating for people to deal with. It is difficult to interpret, and it's quite different to what everyone else has, which does mean we end up with, when we've got decision makers who don't sit in this room, they interpret it in a different way than we would maybe recommend and what it was intended. So what we would propose to be doing with the new scheme is not just providing the draft, but providing a bit of a framework of what would be covered in policy. And there will be elements that we obviously can see quite early on, whether there's big changes in direction and where that work needs to happen. So while we're waiting for the Commission to get back to us on whether we can advertise the scheme, 100% Nathan is not going to get to go on a big long holiday. He will be writing policies, and we can get those started through the process, because otherwise you'll end up with a lot of policies in one meeting. We'll start that happening. We'll start that conversation with the community. And those policies, we can wait until we've got that final version of the scheme, and they can come into force as soon as that scheme does. So it is a matter of timing, and it's a little tricky, but we're pretty clear on how that can work, and we can keep having that conversation. Also, the further we get down the process, the more sure we're going to be about what is approved to go in the scheme, because the draft we send the Planning Commission may well change a bit. We're trying our best to stay engaged with officers at the department, but the officers aren't the ones signing off the scheme. So there's a little bit that will be unknown. So it's that balancing act of resourcing, timeframes, and making sure we can have those conversations with the community as well. In terms of some of the other elements, the list of things in the workshop, I think there's a few things in there that Councillor Sullivan was talking about that maybe it's just in the way we've worded it. So McCabe Street, North Fremantle Height, that's exactly what we'd be talking about in that section there. The development plan areas, there were quite a few that you mentioned in terms of Leighton Beach, Port Beach, that kind of area through there, Knutsford. It might be that we need to separate that out rather than trying to combine them all in one workshop, so we can definitely have a look at that, possibly trying to be a bit ambitious in that initial workshop looking at the West End and all our development plan areas. So if council would like those separated out, the committee can recommend that tonight. There were some other ones, Hampton Road and that South Fremantle area. Absolutely, if that's an area that we'd like to have a look at. Again, like Councillor Sullivan mentioned, there's been attempts over the years to try that, and it might be that through the other conversations we have, we find some initiatives or things that we can do to put in the scheme to try and encourage that, because we can put as many opportunities in a scheme as we like, but if those landowners don't work together to try and figure something out, we end up in a similar position. So those conversations are things we're having internally as well. Do you go with incentives? Do you go with minimums? There's lots and lots of different conversations we can have in that regard. But if we'd like a workshop to focus in on that area of Fremantle, again, committee can recommend that tonight as well. Same with the sea lanes, that's probably been lumped into that development plan area discussion, but yeah, it might be that is its own workshop. Learning from outcomes from those developed areas, 100%, that will be following through all of those discussions as well. With the workshops, we'll definitely be reflecting on what the current framework is, providing that information to you probably in advance to go, look, this is the current provisions, this is what's been developed or what hasn't happened. So you can have a look at that, and we can start from there rather than starting from the baseline. And absolutely can send out a copy of the model scheme text. I'll probably send out a copy of our adopted planning strategy and those kind of key things that we'll need to follow through. I'll probably start sounding a bit like a broken record when I'm reminding you of those things that we need to start from. So apologies in advance, you'll probably get a lot of reading material, but we'll walk you through it, and also be checking in those workshops and working through it as well. I think that was most of the elements, but please let me know if there was anything else you needed clarification on.
Thanks for that, and that sort of certainly answers some of the things that I was concerned about. I think there will definitely need to be, areas like West End protection where we're going to have at least a very robust skeleton of a policy of these are coming out of the scheme, this is going to be in the policy, this is how it works, and you'll see that before we sign off the final sign-off. So making sure that the community feel confident enough that they're not in here, tearing down the draft scheme before we've even presented it to the Commission for consideration. Trying to come back to the... I'll let the others speak. This is something that Councillor Van Dawson might want to jump in as well on. In those areas like McCabe Street, like Port Beach, like any of our development zones, development areas, how do we as an elected body kind of build a conversation about what is the right level of incentivising redevelopment, new development, versus protecting against poor development? And that, if I think back to the processes of Amendment 49 and the Queen Victoria Street one as well, that I think have been relatively successful, and even the Leighton Beach one before then, at bringing development into the mix, but in a way that has been, generally speaking, successful and not, it doesn't have too many terrible failures that everybody just keeps pointing at. So the incentivisation seemed to work well there. But, obviously, if we were in the western suburbs, the state would be saying, oh, you guys are always writing schemes that are really like at a low level because you're too scared of what might come. So you're actually adopting a really, I guess, defensive scheme. So that conversation is probably going to be a really important one for the elected body and the community to kind of understand we have different dials to play around with. What are those dials generally? So that when we start talking about some of these areas specifically, we have a bit of an understanding about what other local governments do, what they do in different states. How can we structure a scheme that's genuinely incentivising the things that we need and want, and protecting simultaneously? Yeah. So I think that early conversation of that might be incredibly helpful. So.
Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. I guess also, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking about the model scheme text and the way that state government at the moment is restricting, as we know, what local governments can do. But it also means that we probably won't have the opportunity to be as restrictive as a Western Suburbs local government, or we are at the moment, because the state government is requiring us to have a level of discretion on all kind of bits and pieces in that scheme. So why I raise that is, I guess we need to also set the expectation with our community that we are also, well, I'm personally upset that we are losing some of that control, but that's not really our call anymore. And we might ask our staff to put forward a draft scheme that is more restrictive or places tighter controls and less discretion, but that is not ultimately likely what's to be approved. I will just quickly pick up on the point of the scheme versus policy, and Councillor Van Dawson, I can see you have your hand up, so I'm going to come to you next. But I agree with Councillor Sullivan and Mayor Lorver that it's going to look odd to people who don't understand planning that we might endorse a scheme, even though it's only going to WAPC and then Minister for Advertising, that we might endorse a scheme that looks like we're going to lose a lot of control. But I'm also, I guess, thinking about the practicality of or the impracticality of drafting policies at the same time, and wanted to put to staff whether or not there would be a possibility of us adopting some, and I don't know how the committee members would feel about this, but is there a way, rather than having basically, as you say, Councillor Sullivan, the skeletons of policies, but a kind of list or schedule of the different policies that we will be implementing, and a clear kind of even a copy and paste of including consideration of these controls that have come out of the scheme, and whether that's something we adopt at the same time as we endorse any scheme to go to WAPC, to be clear that with our community that the intention is to protect all these things, but we know that it's moving from one document to the other and the difference between the two.
Through the chair, absolutely. By the time we get to a finalised draft, we would have an idea about our existing policy framework and what we might want to be carrying forward. So we can absolutely provide this committee, first up, with a bit of an outline of the areas and where policies would be developed. So there would be a clear list of, there'll be detailed design area policies, there'll be a structure plan for this area, and those kind of things. So that map would be provided, and there'll be, places like the West End, it may well be that the existing policy, by and large, has the right themes in it. So obviously those heritage, a lot of that policy talks about the design and the influence of the heritage buildings. A lot of that hasn't and probably won't change. It might just be different provisions that we look at in the scheme that are different. So we'll obviously as well be talking with our comms team and making sure we've got lots of really good information on there. So that in itself is going to be a bit of an exercise to try and make sure we've got information available, that we as staff are available to talk to people as well, to talk them through that without going through the advertising period formally, which we obviously cannot do until we get the sign off. But we can definitely talk them through what the process is, how it works, and this current scheme carries on until the new one is formally gazetted.
Yes. All right. I'm going to go to Councillor Van Dawson online.
Thank you. And thank you, Councillor Sullivan. Agree with everything you've said tonight pretty much, and certainly the intent of it. Just to touch on a couple of things in terms of the workshop agenda, I agree that particularly the West End Heritage and the development area workshop should probably be split into two. I think they're both, big conversations, otherwise setting aside some substantial time for long workshops to cover everything that need to be. It's quite a lot. I think it's an ambitious schedule we've got in terms of meeting that October. I think it was October put in there for like the draft scheme, or the new scheme to be drafted. So that's quite ambitious. So we've got a lot to get through. And just and just agreeing in terms of how important it will be to have, whilst one of the objectives is to have a simplified scheme, or what we have to do in accordance with the model scheme tests and everything, but just the importance of having a planning framework and good policies to support the new scheme, so that we get the decision making that we want, and incentives will be absolutely key. I think we all want good development. We want development, but we want good development. And whilst policies are only due regard documents, they've saved us many times, even particularly where substantial discretion is being sought. I mean, if it's, in my experience, in planning decision making, when the planning framework consists of a very basic scheme that really needs to focus on what our key priorities are, such as heritage protection, West End, that sort of thing. We sort of, I think, through this process, we'll identify what are the key priorities, for our city that we want to protect but also in terms of the sort of development we want, and how to best incentivize that. But I was just going to say, where I've been in planning decision, and there is quite a basic scheme in place, decision makers do look to the planning framework, like where is the guidance, and so that will come in the policies that we prepare in support of the scheme. And I do think, whilst not needing to be done for the draft scheme, I think there will be a lot of concern in the community if they don't have a lot of sort of fear, if they don't have a clear picture of what a policy might look like. And I don't want to add to everyone's workload too much, but even maybe we do need to focus on, I think we can all sort of predict what the state government will accept, and through this process, obviously not now, but in preparing our scheme, I think we can have robust discussions about what we think will be well received by the state government, what they're looking for, what we're looking for, and how we might best achieve it. But it's I think there will be fear in the community, so if we could even have at least one draft policy, probably on like one of the key things like Heritage West End or something, that sort of is an example of how we would, to provide an example of what our framework would look like, would be helpful. So not relying on existing policies, but just at least be reviewing and have ready to go a draft policy at the same time. Yeah, I don't know. It's just sort of like, how do we present it to the community and bring them on the journey, and not creating fear and issues, but actually being on the front foot with it, like anticipating what the community will be concerned about, and then sort of demonstrating, having an example of what the framework will look like, not just the draft scheme, but so basically reiterating what Andrew said. Thank you.
Thank you. Just another question, because this is my first planning scheme adoption rodeo. And I know we always try to get everything as close to what we'd like to see as a council as possible. But if we so my question is, we get to November, we've got a draft scheme, goes out for public comment, WP says, yes, go for that. And the public says, oh, we missed something or we need to change something. If there is an amendment that needs to be made at that point, I'm trying to figure out how close we need to be in November. There's an amendment that this council decides needs to be made after it goes out for public advertising. Would then we have to ask permission to re-advertise the new scheme, or is it depending upon the severity of the amendment? And there's a lot of what ifs in there that we can't answer right now.
Through the chair, it really does depend on the extent of change, a bit like when council's adopting a local planning policy. If after advertising there's some minor changes, it may not need re-advertising. If there are broad scale changes in direction or relatively decent ones, you would need to go back and recommence the process again. So it does extend it out, but at the same time, that engagement and advertising from the community is really important to get a sense of whether we've hit the mark or not. To be clear as well, the new scheme needs to follow the direction that the local planning strategy has set. So that went through an engagement process. What we'd be doing through this next year is just touching base again, making sure that that direction is still aligned with where everyone is wanting to head. The scheme just takes it to that more detailed level and more specific site by site. So yeah, if we wanted to change direction completely from that document and the community went, well, everything is completely wrong, yep, need to start again.
I'm just going to quickly clarify that because that's helpful and a good pickup. I mean, not to hope too much work on the staff, but I hope that after advertising we have some amendments to make. I don't think we should expect that we're going to nail it on our first go. But I had a question about the different types of amendments. When there's an amendment after advertising for a scheme, is it dealt with the same as an amendment to an existing scheme in terms of how they rate standard? I can't remember what the other one's called. There's like a minor amendment, a standard amendment, and then a major amendment. Is it rated the same? I mean, really everything requires advertising unless it's an administrative change or it's going in line with state planning policy, is my understanding.
Through the chair, I'd probably need to have a good read through the regulations, but my understanding is because it's a whole new document, the whole thing would need to go back. So there are different ways you can deal with it as well. If it is something that you go, well, we want to change this, but we don't necessarily want to hold up the whole scheme, you can wait for it to be gazetted and do an amendment that way. So there's lots of different avenues to take it down. You obviously wouldn't do that if you aren't happy with the provisions that are going in there. You would, take it back to the change. It probably also depends on the change that's being proposed and whether maybe it's aligning with the state government change. There's probably a few different things that could influence that. But the advertising period shouldn't be for nothing. It should be something that we consider, and as officers we'll need to review any feedback we get through that period and respond in some way, whether it is by changing the wording of the scheme or saying, look, it's broadly in line with what the community's after and putting it to council to endorse or not.
Thank you. Am I allowed to go ask Councillor Clark if she has anything to say? I was going to let Andrew go and then I'll... Okay. Only, Councillor Sullivan, I like to hear all your thoughts, but I just want to give Councillor Clark the opportunity to make sure she can respond to the points made thus far, and then we can continue on.
No, I'm agreeing with what I'm hearing generally, so no, it's great. And I do very much appreciate the IP and everything that sits within Andrew's brain, Councillor Sullivan's brain, and also Councillor Van Dawson's. So having worked in that area, I was concerned with the timing too, just on how far will we get into this process. And also as a council, we will need to be very aware of that timing, and as a whole council, not throwing more work. We're really going to have to consider if something comes up. We have the con stores and those sorts of things. So we just need to really discuss those when they come through with the department. But And when we were first discussing who would like to sit on this committee, my question was, how brave do we want to be as a city? Because am I just wasting my time? Are we just going to run through this? And I have the confidence that we'll approach this really well as a community and as a team. So that's great. And communication will be absolutely everything. And by brave, I don't mean it's going berserk. I mean it's really protecting what we really need to protect, and also going more open and bigger where we need to. We want to be Quimbies. That's quality in my backyard. So, and quality doesn't necessarily mean spending more money and making flashier buildings or anything like that. It's about what we value as a community, and ensuring that people in the smallest apartments, so that they can afford to live here, have fresh air and light and all those sorts of basic things. So thanks, but I'm happy with what I'm hearing so far.
Fantastic. Councillor Sullivan?
Thanks, and I kind of wanted to just follow up on that conversation about what happens when we, get to the other end of the advertising period, and there's matters that that the community still feel have a significant concern about, that they're actually demanding some change in. And I think we probably need to make sure that we collectively kind of have some ways of testing ourselves along the way to help avoid that situation. So there are some things which would clearly have to be in the scheme because they're so important to the people of Fremantle, and absolutely need to be protected or whatever. And that a scheme without those is a scheme that we might find that we have to change at the 11th hour, which we don't want to do. Then there's all the other stuff, which is the opportunity that a scheme can bring. And if the scheme isn't perfect on day one, there's opportunity to amend it on day one of the new scheme. So I think we probably need this sort of way of testing ourselves along the way to go, have we captured all the things that are critical in terms of safeguarding and protecting and the like? And are there things that we still would like to keep talking about, provided that they're really about new opportunities or expanding the opportunities that already exist? So if we don't get, McCabe Street perfect on day one, that's fine. But have we got all the essentials in there that people in the community are going to need to feel safe for? So testing that continuously, checking that we're on track for that, I think will avoid those sort of dilemmas down the track, because we want a new scheme. We certainly don't want to be bogged down toing and froing from the West Australian Planning Commission because, Nathan wanted to get on with his policy writing. So, as we will. So I'm sort of asking the staff, is there ways of developing that kind of matrix of checking along the way that we're on track to avoid, a major political bum fight at the critical moment?
Thanks, Chloe. Stereo. Really good questions. I think at a very high level, planning is a continuum anyway. It is going to continue to change. And we do need to make some tough decisions at certain points to say, is it good enough? Yes, move on. Otherwise, you'll never get a new scheme. Really good question. We've got to make sure the important things are right and good enough to keep going. And we can make amendments as we go forward. And I think that's the job of this committee and staff, to make sure that we're holding ourselves to account and asking those hard questions. Is it good enough? Can we move forward? What do we put on the parking lot to keep working on into the future? The only other thing I would like to say at this point, to Councillor Sullivan's point, is a really good call about the community. And I think when we're talking about planning, we're talking about a very complex community. There's the community that elected the City of Fremantle councillors, but planning's about the existing community. It's also about the community that doesn't live here, that we want to encourage to come here, that currently can't afford to live here. And so planning's about that community too, and how do we make sure we get that input to that discussion? Because I can guarantee one thing, not everybody in the existing Fremantle community will love the new scheme. There's always going to be an element of it which won't satisfy everybody. This is going to be a hard journey, and I think it's constantly reviewing that and making sure on balance we've got that right, and the communication is going to be vital.
Thank you for your response. I think that's true. I mean, I guess when I think about the matrix and how we're going to check it, I have written down in my notes that we should make an AI tool, which sounds crazy, but I think I guess when what you were saying, Councillor Sullivan, is really that there's we need to be checking risks across a variety of communities, and one, as the director pointed out, is us. The other is the community that exists here, the political appetite at the state level, and then also I think it was a good point from the director about the community that we envisage, I guess, as the people who are setting the strategic direction to also take up space in Fremantle. Noting that we have been discussing the forward look for 45 minutes. Does anyone else have anything to say, or I will move us towards a vote on the item? The recommendation being that we are going to receive the project overview and support the schedule of monthly internal workshops as printed out before us or in attachment 1. Mel?
Yeah, just quickly, given all the discussion, how important it is for us to be doing this work, I just wanted to thank staff for putting something before us that I think will largely get us there. So thank you for thinking this through very thoroughly, and I look forward to our ongoing discussions.
Yeah, so just, I guess the question would be, do we need to modify this very subtly to sort of say, to pick up capturing at least some of the inputs from the committee? Not sure whether Mel has a...
Yep. Through the chair, Councillor Sullivan is correct. Just procedurally, in committee, I would recommend that you would make an amendment if there is something in particular, and you discuss some policy and things like that. And along the way, I would recommend that you make those amendments if there is something in particular that you would like to note, and then that would be recommended to council as an action that we would then deal with after the committee and do what we need to do with it. So in regards to policy, for example, it may be around consideration of key priorities as part of that policy. So it may not be drafting the policy and having a final view of it, but perhaps what officers may look at when they're developing that policy when it comes back and the like. But certainly things that you want us to consider after this meeting and so on, we would certainly, I would recommend adding them to the recommendation.
So there are two parts to the recommendation. One is receiving the project overview. I mean, I think we'd be here all night if we tried to write a dot point list of ideas or whatever, so that's probably not a good idea. I'm sure the staff were busy jotting stuff down. But the schedule of monthly internal workshops, I think maybe there are a couple of elements that we did discuss that maybe could just be subject to further tailoring of the workshops to take into account the X, Y, and Z that we talked about. And we've got to try and remember what the X, Y, and Z are.
Just to jog your memory, perhaps, Councillor Sullivan, one, I believe, was separating workshop 1 into 2 parts.
Yep.
The first being Heritage Protection Clause in West End, and as 1A, I guess, and then 1B being Development Plan Areas, Leighton Beach, Knutsford, perhaps naming Sea Lanes development area within that list. And no, where am I? I've got my own notes on here. North Fremantle Height. I mean, we've heard from staff tonight, will include the McCabe Street area, so not sure whether or not you want to specify that.
No, that was an answer, so
happy.
that's
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then the other ones that I have from your list were the neighbourhood centre in South Fremantle and the area being also including the Portuguese Club site. So not sure whether you would like those in
Yeah,
the
there were
amendment.
a bunch of them, but I'm not sure whether we really want to list those.
yeah.
Whether there's a more generalised way of just, allowing the staff to take that list and go, how am I going to plug all that in?
Yeah,
So
open to feedback. To the director?
Is that on through the chair? I think it'd be quite possible for us to have this conversation at one of the workshops, maybe workshop 1, so we can focus on the heritage areas and then bring this list back and refine it as we go. I'm not sure it really needs a full resolution here. It's good to have a structure. It's good to keep to the plan because this is a lot of work. But I think workshop 1 we can refine. The next perhaps 2 sessions. What we want to look at?
yeah, so it could be as general as, with the city to refine the content of the workshops to take into account the input from committee and subsequent conversations. Yeah, I mean that's really what we're talking about. Is we're not just signing off on the list. We're saying, great
Yes.
start. Think about this.
Councillor
Modify it as required. Be adaptive.
Councillor Sullivan, just to clarify, once the words are there, are you happy to move that as an amendment and then we'll get a seconder and vote on it?
That's fine. I'll move that.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Clark? Any commentary on the amendment on the screen? Great. I'm going to put the amendment to a vote. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Carried. All right. Are there any further comments from committee members on the officer's recommendation as amended on the screen? No. Great. I'm going to put that to a vote. All those in favour? And that's unanimous. Carried. All right. We're going to move to item number 2, which is the Freo Alternative Review 2026. Is there a mover for this item? Councillor Sullivan, seconded by Mayor Lawver. Open to debate, if anyone would like to begin. I'm happy to start talking. I have some notes. It was really interesting to read through the Freo Alternative Review report. I've heard a lot about Freo Alternative while I've been on council, but it was interesting to, I guess, have it put next to the R codes and the requirements by the R codes and think about whether or not it's actually producing a good outcome. I think it was an absolutely well-intentioned and well-delivered scheme amendment at the time, but in hindsight, it hasn't really delivered us many results, and there were a few reasons for that outlined in the report. I thought it was interesting that the kind of really significant changes and points of difference, if we are going to support allowing this to expire to recommend an expiry, was that the open space minimum requirements are much lower. So at the Freo Alternative required a 70% minimum, whereas our codes are far lower. And I guess that we're losing the requirement for it to go through the development assessment kind of panel process and the sustainability requirements as outlined. So I think it was interesting to read and to think about how those might be also brought into any policies. Probably won't be allowed to have them in our scheme going forward to apply across the development. But yeah, I am happy to support the officer's recommendation, really, and we'll open up to anyone else for comments. Mayor?
Like you, I was not on council when the Freo Alternative was first adopted, but having the report was very helpful for me to understand the history, and it was pretty forward-thinking when it was adopted. So congratulate the council today for thinking these things through. And while it always kind of makes me nervous to get rid of things that help protect open space and things like that. I agree with the officer's recommendation. This is probably the best way to go. And if we can get the essence or the best bits of this into some great policies, or if it's appropriate into our new scheme, I think that will be a great conversation that we have down the track.
Councillor Sullivan?
Thanks. Yeah, look, I must admit I remember, being of two minds, even at the beginning of this, wondering whether all of the effort was really going to be worth it at the end of the day, whether we were actually going to see significant take-up in this, but more importantly, transferring traditional, boring triplex development or whatever that we've seen destroy so much of Perth, and replacing that with a genuine progressive kind of approach. Now, obviously, thankfully, the Planning Commission eventually caught up with some of the more progressive ideas that this council and other councils have had over the years. And of course, the Fremantle Alternative kind of, pushed their buttons a little bit in the process of getting them there, because they could see that councils like Freo were doing things which were where the movers and shakers in the commission wanted to go, but were being thwarted by the politics of the day that was sort of, I guess, coming from the Satterley syndrome or somewhere, I don't know. It is disappointing that 5 years of incredibly hard and intense planning resulted in 7 or 8 years of an opportunity that only delivered 4 developments, some of which are not particularly liked by the community. So it has been disappointing, and I do agree that we shouldn't proceed with it or continue with it. But I also have in my mind that are we missing the more important part of the conversation, which is, are we happy with the kind of development that the density codes that we currently have are going to continue to push out those very types of developments that we were fighting against or rallying against when we decided we wanted something better. So are the ARCO, if we're sort of just going, well, the newer versions of the ARCOdes are providing opportunities for people to do developments, but are they still going to be, open space of 50%, which we know equals Ned Kelly style housing, where you don't have a lot of opportunity for anything, and the like. So are we happy with that, or should we be exploring things? I mean, I don't know whether for example, one of the reasons the Freo Alternative didn't work is had we down-zoned areas and said, well, you can't do that crap style of development anymore because you haven't got enough land, but you can do this because we're incentivizing it. So is there something that we should be doing in the new scheme that actually helps us avoid the shitty developments that take up, just put brick paving everywhere and driveways everywhere and the like? Or are we actually okay that the new codes are working okay in the Fremantle context? So I think that's a conversation that perhaps needs to happen. I don't know the answer because I don't know what new developments are looking like with the codes the way they are now compared to what we were trying to avoid back nearly 10 years ago, when this was sort of first being discussed. So that might be a conversation that you might want to bring to us. I think we did try. I think the comment in the report absolutely sums it up. So thank you for that. It was just too big of a demand, and it got built over a period of time. There were people who kept bringing in new ideas and kept saying, we've got to include this, we've got to include this. and without testing whether that was actually going to be any form of incentive. So your comments that, we were demanding, a better approach to density, and we were demanding a better approach to sustainability, and we were demanding a better approach to vegetation retention and canopy cover, and that we were also demanding that development include community built into the principle of the development. And yeah, it was overreach. So I think this council needs to learn that lesson and go, what was the key thing that we really wanted to achieve in those areas? And to my way of thinking, it was development that just didn't obliterate everything and produce no vegetation and no sense of the sort of things that we love in Fremantle, So I would have just gone with, density bonus and 60% open space, because that's what Audric recommended originally, and somehow we decided it should be 70%. And that's probably the thing that really made it impossible. So, yeah. But yeah, I would love to hear at some stage the officers being able to kind of, with their knowledge of individual developments out there, kind of let us know what we're sort of seeing with infill development in the burbs at the moment, and whether there's something that we should be doing.
I'm just going to respond quickly to some of that, because I think it's true. And one of the things, Councillor Sullivan and I have had some discussions recently about the way, our codes mean that we don't have discretion as a council, and it doesn't come to elected members at all, but it also, our officers don't have a chance to say, oh, well, we wish you would just paint that a different colour because it would, really improve the look, or we wish that you would not do all of that in paving. Because when something's deemed to comply, it's deemed to comply, and there's no such thing as a kind of soft planning discretion. It just doesn't exist. And I agree that, I don't necessarily agree with all of the outcomes from the R-codes, but I also don't think that it's possible for our scheme to overrule the R-codes as a state planning policy. So it'd be interesting to think about ways that we can challenge it, but I would imagine that challenging it would include zoning everything to R160 or something, and then just hoping that someone doesn't build a skyscraper in the middle of South Fremantle or Hilton or Wacom, but open to feedback on how we might challenge it in other ways. The only other thing I was going to say is that I think it is interesting, Free Alternative, when I was reading back through the report, really did try and put all the protections in, which was fantastic. And now, luckily, we have things like our tree retention policy, which mean that they are, those outcomes are supported in a different policy. And the last thing I thought I would just note was when I was reading the report and thinking about, how do we incentivize good design for infill, which is not necessarily done by big developers. One of the points that came through in the report was that when staff had talked to people who've tried to use the policy or have been successful in eventually getting something up using this local planning policy, one of the comments was that a barrier to implementing it is that it was of such a complexity that it was kind of tailored towards industry professionals, and so less experienced builders or I guess people who are just looking to do infill in their backyard couldn't, it wasn't accessible to them. And good for us to consider as people who review policies that we need to make sure people can understand it, because if you go to a policy and it looks too confusing, then it's easy to give up. Councillor Clark?
Thank you. I think that, obviously there was nothing but great intention from the former council that implemented this, and I guess that what's key to everything is that, as our director said, everything's an evolution. So the way we live is an evolution constantly. The community, who we are, is a constant evolution, and those who've lived here for decades upon decades know that, and we see that, and it's ever changing. Our financial world is an evolution, and the way that property is now valued in a city that was once people really didn't want to touch because it had old buildings or that were run down. And now everyone wants to get their hands on those old buildings and will pay a lot of money for it, which then pushes out the essence and culture of who we are as a community in our creatives and the people who don't earn big bucks, generally speaking, unless they hit it big. We have had some musicians do that, and that's fantastic. But we need to keep including the people who bring that culture into the city. And so I feel in changing this out, we have the opportunity to take that next step while maintaining all of the good intentions that came with it, and things that were included in there were making it easier to put a granny flat in your backyard. And that decision that was made those years ago has enabled so many people to stay living here in this town now, because they wouldn't have somewhere else to rent. They couldn't rent a regular house now, so they're living in granny flats, and people are able to do that. And I would hope that going forward, we're able to look at concepts that have been put forward by our community, people like Ros D'Souza and Sarah, Booth, brain freeze. Brain freeze, they created Shop House, where a creative could live in the front of of basically what would otherwise be a one-room kind of living with a bathroom, but they could have their studio and practice at the front of that, to be able to run their business from it too. There's things like that could be key to maintaining those people and not becoming a gentrified Disneyland in Fremantle, which is my greatest concern for us going forward as people are priced out.
Thank you. I'm going to double check. Councillor Van Dawson, do you have any comments on this item?
No, nothing to add to this one. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Clark, I agree. And I think what you and Councillor Sullivan are talking about is kind of the same of we're up against the R code. So from memory, Shop House isn't viable because R codes don't allow, or the National Building Construction Code standards, which I had to try and read at work this week and was really hard. There's lots of those things, that standards and R codes, which we are up against. So how do we kind of rejig it in innovative ways? Councillor Sullivan, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I actually had that on my list as well. As like, there are two things. If I had the time again, and we do have the time again because we're starting with a new approach, but I would probably emphasise that in terms of providing the diversity and keeping the sort of cultural mix of Fremantle alive, it's probably more important to focus on the development areas rather than the little infill opportunities that exist, that occur during subdivision. So not focus too much on the development that happens in the burbs, but focus on how do we get development sites like the Beaconsfield, Lefroy Road Quarry or Knutsford Street or those sort of areas. How do we get those actually moving so that they're the ones that are providing that diversity of housing, the diversity of mixtures of use, the diversity of cohabiting different types of land uses together and the like. So really focus on that. If you think about how much, I'd hate to think how much officer time and energy went into the development of the Fremantle alternative, but would that time have been better spent, having an officer just dedicated on Lefroy Road to try and find a solution, for example? So I'm not sure how you translate that into a scheme process, but I think you've sort of heard some of the ideas around the table that, maybe they, we do need to focus on what opportunities exist to be able to use property without subdivision. How do we diversify the granny flat or the shop house or those sort of things? Because I actually think that is true Freo developers developing. That is people who already own a place and want to expand how it gets utilised, trying to do something in the same old way that we used to be able to do because no one was watching. So, you know, so that's going to be key going forward, I think. Yeah.
All right, are we happy if I put this one to a vote? All those in favour? Okay, unanimous, carried. We're going to move to our third item, which is the mixed use areas review. If I can have a mover, please. Mayor and a seconder? Councillor Clark. Fantastic.
Great. I guess just to kind of get us started, the amount of time that went into this item as well, it's just phenomenal. And thank you, staff, for not just looking at it on your desktop, but going out in the field and looking at what's happening in all these wonderful spaces. And I largely agree with a lot of what's in the report, but I didn't know that we were going to be prepared tonight to potentially go through each one by one and maybe add our thoughts or comments. So, but also when things come from committee and when they're passed, especially unanimously to council, it's kind of a subtle endorsement. So I was wondering if on this item, if we could potentially add something that would be, what did I write down? That we do what's on there, but then we also invite councillors to review this review and the reports that are prepared, and just be prepared to bring any amendments that they might think when this comes to council. Just so that way it's a signal to the other elected members that there might be things in here that we might want to change, that they might want to change. Because the mixed use zone, like for me, I was thinking, do we need one blanket mixed use? Because, is that what came through to me when reading this, that mixed use might mean different things in different parts of the city. And I think we might want to have that conversation. So it's just a thought. I'm just asking the question if that's something that might be able to be looked at. And also people that live in different parts of the city might be more intimately familiar with, because there's quite a few of them on here. So just thought I'd ask that question before we got started.
I'm going to, Councillor Sullivan, I know you have your microphone on, but I'm going to get some advice on this. I guess my first thoughts are, I understand what you're saying, Mayor, about it being a subtle endorsement, but this option is always open. So whether or not we need to include it in the recommendation that we passed this evening, also just going back, my understanding of what we are receiving and noting tonight is the recommendation of the mixed use area review, which in itself says that it will investigate rationalising the zoning to retain mixed use zones where acting as buffer areas and to review the R60 density bonus. So not major changes as to how they currently exist. So open to feedback from the manager in terms of including this from a governance perspective.
I'll just withdraw the question, actually, because you're right. It's always an option for people to propose amendments, and I think those three recommendations are really, really well put. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, open if I've also interpreted that wrong in terms of how we want to handle this as a committee, and perhaps this evening, perhaps when it comes to council, that we'll have space in between in terms of what we actually want from the mixed use area review report, rather than just receiving it. Is there an action that's not specified in that recommendation that we are seeking officers to take? Councillor Sullivan?
Yeah, look, I mean, I also sort of, went down the rabbit hole of looking at each one and thinking, now what would we need for that to make that one work? And what really stood out for me was sort of at the end of it going, this is actually where a combination of dual density coding and policy is probably the answer, because there's not one of those areas that's the same as the next one, really, in terms of what if our starting point was what is our preferred development outcome for each of those individual areas, we'd probably come up with quite different scenarios. So, for example, on High Street up here, I'd probably be thinking that the coding would be higher than 60. It'd probably maybe even be 100. So it might be that, it's I don't know what the coding is at the moment. It might be R35/R100. If you apply the mixed use rules, but then have almost like a development area approach, particular policy that talks about what's the character of that area? What are we trying to achieve in that area? Do we need shops? Do we need commercial on the ground floor? Do we need to have 25%? Those sort of things. In some areas, you might still want that. In other areas, you might not want it at all. But what you're really trying to do is get the right sort of development. So you're trying to come up with a way of zoning an area that gives you diversity and mixture without necessarily defining what that mixture is overall, and actually doing it in a more of a policy setting and a coding setting. So I'd be interested to hear what staff feedback is on that, because this is a major area, and there's a lot of opportunities that have been missed because the mixed use zoning isn't actually doing what it originally was doing, because things rapidly change. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is that the situation changes way quicker than we can change a scheme. And that stifled development. But of course, policy can be changed quite quickly. So do we have a structure that allows policy to keep abreast of the need? So you take South Terrace, well, you might be saying, hey, we don't need any more shop fronts, really. Quite happy to have shop houses where the ground floor of a 2-storey element has a little bit of activating kind of usage, but isn't necessarily commercial in a sense. And also maybe we're just happy to have buildings which are adaptable for the future rather than being having to be a shop on the ground floor, for example. So they're the sort of things that you might be able to be adaptive in a policy and flow with the trends. So I'm interested to know how far we can take that within the context of the codes. And are we embellishing the art codes, or are we kind of going completely against them in the opposite direction?
Through the chair, without getting too detailed with it, the mixed use zone would have a set of objectives which come from the model scheme text now, and it really is to provide that buffer between quite often centres or major roads and a residential area. So the report kind of goes through that. In that sense, they've probably done quite well. So mixed use is probably an appropriate zoning for us to maintain in the scheme in some shape or form. Each of those areas can have a different density coding. So not all of the mixed use zones need to have the same density. So we can go and be very localised with that. A bit like with our heritage area policy, it is place-based. So we can have provisions that look at, okay, well, this site is really well located to public transport, might be close to a centre, it probably can cope with some more density, or there's some design provisions that we need to implement because of the heritage area. The codes can be, the deemed to comply provisions of the codes can be changed through policy. There are certain ones that we don't need the Commission's approval to change, and there are some that we do. So it does allow us to be responsive to the local context, and that's what we would need to be working through. But at a high level in a scheme, you'd look at those locations and apply density coding and the zoning. The land use provisions would be in the table. They'd apply to all of them. You can add additional uses. You can add additional provisions. Probably one of the biggest things we've found with the mixed use zones at the moment is that blanket, very low density, and the opportunity to go up to fairly low R60, subject to meeting very rigid criteria, which doesn't always work, and forcing the commercial element, where in some places we probably want to boost the residential that is in that location. So plenty of options available to us. But yeah, there are options.
Unless you have something quick to say, Councillor Sullivan, is it okay if I ask a follow-up question? All right. I guess to clarify, two things. One is that there's a definition update of mixed use now, as per the model scheme. And when I was reading it, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind was the South Terrace car wash that managed to get through, and it snuck through because it's a mixed use area. The difference between our current definition of mixed use and the state's definition of mixed use is that industry is not it's not noted in the state model definition, which I think does really change the clear objectives when planning decision makers look at it. And interesting to also remember that it can be a different density. I guess my question though is, we're being asked to receive this and that staff are going to go away and do some work. I would assume that the work that staff do now is going to be incorporated into our scheme as the kind of outcome of this item. But I wonder whether noting that lots of it, as councillors have noted, is dependent on the location, and we in these workshops will be going through the different objectives for the different specific locations. Is it something that we kind of get an update on how staff are feeling about it in workshop 6 alongside this R60 density bonus, given we've just adopted some flexibility into this workshop outline? Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. To say that would be an R60 density bonus and an update on how staff are feeling about mixed use zones, because I guess we want to avoid a situation where the scheme comes out and we've gotten rid of some, or the objectives aren't feeling quite right, given we will have, I mean, hopefully in the discussions to come we'll clarify that, but I guess I'm looking to Councillor Sullivan and other councillors to see whether there would be appetite for that. But it could be a good way for us to look at it again informally before it comes to us in the draft scheme alongside everything else we have to discuss. But yes.
Through the chair, a bit like the director mentioned before, planning is a bit of an evolution. So this is a very early report. So as we start working through different topics, different locations, start gathering more information, there will be things that evolve and change. So these mixed use zones don't exist in isolation. There are other things that influence it. As we start talking about housing diversity and housing opportunities, we might go, we need to make some changes here. Maybe we need to evolve and update. So as we're going through, the idea of these committees and the workshops is to update you as to where we're at, and see if we can keep working through solutions. So while this provides that really good research that Nathan and his team have done on those areas and gives some suggestions about where we might take things, if we discover more things as we go, we'll absolutely be updating and evolving. So plenty of work to happen and plenty of discussion to occur between us all.
Yeah, I guess my first thought was about that car wash as well, and how that got through. And I guess so. I would take it we can only have one designation as mixed use. We can have mixed use A, B, C, D for different areas. So with the way for us to consider looking at issues similar to the car wash, that would be to have the table that we proposing to change for convenience stores, make that a similar thing in that table for mixed use zones. So while it may be allowed, because it's totally appropriate to have a car wash in some of these mixed use zones, but not others, just have it be one of those items that requires that council discretion and council and advertising. Is that with the recommendation as these things go forward?
Through the chair, the zoning table, yes, absolutely would be linked to those, to the mixed use zone. There is another section in the scheme, and I'm going to look to Nathan here to make sure it's still in the model scheme text for the additional uses. So if there are site-specific things that we go, look, this location, there's a land use there that we want to maintain, but it's probably a bit different to the other broad interpretation of the zones throughout the city. There are ways to identify those locations for things. I think the vet on Ellen Street is an example of using that provision. So there are ways through that, and it might be that if there is a cluster of uses together, we go, maybe the mixed use zone isn't the right one for that location. So there will be conversations that we have that from time to time go from lot to lot. So strap in.
Just to quickly add, Matt, in terms of the zoning tables, we as a committee, I guess, could put forward that we want to be more conservative with our zoning table to make sure that those things are a discretionary use rather than permitted. But also knowing, as the manager said, that additional uses are allowed, they have to argue and prove that they meet the objectives of that zone. So I guess that's us then relying on the definition of a mixed use development or a mixed use zone. And if we're happy with that, then we're happy with that. But we might just not want to include a site there because it's too risky, or however we feel about that. Councillor Sullivan?
Yeah, thanks. And I think the biggest issue with that particular one was not so much that the land use was allowed or not allowed, was actually came down to the preferred character of the area not being defined. And so this is where I feel that the mixed use zones actually need, you know, more work in that policy area that actually deals with each of those areas and the character of that. And so what I was going to suggest is that we could probably add some words that basically at the end, along the lines of noting that each mixed use zone may require bespoke scheme and policy settings that are appropriate to deliver the preferred character of that area. Is it the preferred character of the area? What's the normal? Yeah, you know what I mean. But there's a particular phrase that's always used. So, so I think that's general enough to kind of say where we think we need to head without getting down to detail. I don't know if you need. Did you get most of that? Wow, well done.
All right, we've
The benefit of me speaking slowly.
Councillor Sullivan has moved that, and Mayor Lorva has seconded that as an amendment. Any discussion on the amendment? All right. I will put that amendment to a vote. All those in favour? All right, and then we're back to, oh sorry, unanimous, carried, correct. I forgot to say these things. Now we're back to the officer's recommendation as amended. Councillor Van Dawson, do you have anything to say online?
Nothing to add really. Thank you to the officers for their great work. This is, yeah, great reporting that will help, really help with drafting our scheme. Yeah, nothing to add. Thank you.
All right. It seems that we are happy to move forward. I just want to check with officers. I'm happy to not include it as an amendment, but is it possible for this to come back as part of workshop 6? Or would you prefer procedurally for us to note that the kind of position of officers as to mixed use zones and perhaps the draft of the policy settings about preferred character come back to us in a workshop?
Yeah, we can add it.
As an amendment? All right.
We can add it as an informational note.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm going to put this item to a vote then. All those in favour? Great, that's unanimous and carried. There are no motions of which previous notice has been given, no urgent business, no late items and no confidential business. Please be advised that all of our committee recommendations will be presented to Council at the first ordinary meeting of Council of the following month, which is 13 May 2026. And I will now declare the meeting closed at 7:29 p.m. Woohoo!